Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank the witnesses for sitting through a second round of questioning. Mr. Taylor, Professor Taylor, rather, I want to go back to you. You spoke in the first round about, we were finishing our discussion, I didn't get to go any further, about how Greece should restructure its debt. That's what they should have been required to do. And in the Wall Street Journal, you did an article talking about sovereign debt collective action clauses. And I guess I wanted you to expand a bit on these clauses. Let me tell you what the thrust of my question is. I'm concerned that taking the board's discretion away, not having any flexibility, will impede the operations. Just is not workable. So under what circumstances should the IMF require restructuring versus kind of reprofiling a country's debt? Should this, you say it should be part of a preset requirement, but what would be wrong with sort of a case-by-case basis within some framework?
Well, a framework, in its own sense, has less case-by-case to it. There's a treatment of this is how we're going to treat people or countries in different circumstances. It sort of lays out your strategy to do it. There are different cases, and whether that's sustainable or not sustainable, for example, that creates different cases, but you say how you're going to treat those different cases. So there is flexibility in the sense you've laid out your strategy. But that's laid out in advance as much as you can so people can understand it and so we can assess whether it's working or not and see when there's exceptions to it. Okay. I think that's the way to think about it. There's always a sense in which, especially if you're in public policy, you'd like to get around that framework. You'd like to, for some reason, do it differently. I've been there myself. I know what happens. Somebody get a call from somebody who says, look, there's something wrong here. You know, our bank is in trouble. Could you help us out? And you want to be able to resist that because, no, you got your principles, you got your rules, you got your strategy in place. If it becomes all tactics, it becomes hopeless. So I think that's the...
But the whole point of this hearing is to talk about, you know, moral hazard versus contagion. And I guess I'm concerned that completely abandoning the new regime that's being proposed would of course help us avoid more moral hazard, just to say, you know, we're not going to lend to you. But I guess Ms. Lutzinger, Mr. Lowry, do you think that would increase the contagion?
Thank you. I would be a little bit worried because I fear that if they set this in place, there's going to have to be some sense to everyone, the market, everyone, what's the number? What's the debt to GDP number? That's going to be the cutoff. I mean, of course, we have the Maastricht numbers in Europe of 60%, and we've seen how well that's worked. But we don't know really what's sustainable in countries. And so in Ukraine, they've set a goal of 70% of GDP. In Greece, the goal was set at 120% of GDP after. I mean, how do we know what exactly is sustainable and is unsustainable? And my fear is that we'll be faced, U.S. authorities would be faced with a situation of a country saying, no, I'm going to take the measures, I'm going to adjust, I want to honor my debts. I mean, Brazil did this early in the 2000s. They were not going to restructure, even though market commentators all over the place were saying Brazil would have to restructure. They did not restructure. They had a fund program. They drew on it. They adjusted and turned things around. And so it's very hard if you have someone like that calling the White House and saying, no, I'm not going to restructure my debts. The fund's pushing me into something that's not needed, for the U.S. bilaterally to resist that, right, if it's a key U.S. ally. So I think we need to keep the flexibility. Thank you.
On my part, you're talking about a very, very tricky issue, which is the nuances of moral hazard and the nuances of contagion. I am not a humongous believer that there is moral hazard to countries. I am a believer there is moral hazard to lenders and to investors. But could there be contagion? I think the answer is yes, but that does not mean that we should have the exceptional access or systemic exemption for the exceptional access does strike me as a loophole that is extremely large. And so I would want to tighten it up, whether it's going back to the proposal that John Taylor is talking about, going to the proposal the IMF staff is pushing. I would want to close it up a bit because of that worry.